or past. So, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Zimmer. I'm from Climate Kick, an organization based in Europe, and I'm working particularly on land use and on landscapes. I'm also co-lead of the finance design team of the 1000 Landscape program. And I will have the pleasure to moderate this webinar series this afternoon. So this webinar is part of a series of webinars dealing with strategies for funding landscape initiatives and partnerships. So it's one of the activities of the finance design team of the 1000 Landscape for 1 Billion People program. And this series is about a number of mechanisms and tools that can be utilized by landscapes in order to access finance. This particular webinar will be on carbon finance as a catalyst for integrated landscape transformation. I will start with a few housekeeping notes. Please introduce yourself in the chat by indicating where you are, from which organization, and perhaps also your position. We will use the chat function in particular during this webinar. So please use this option to introduce yourself, but also to ask your questions. Please consider also that we will be having breakout sessions during the second part of the webinar. So get prepared also to share your insight and thoughts in these smaller groups, but of course don't hesitate to start with putting them already in the chat. And finally, we will circulate a full report and the results from the session, along with other resources and materials from the 1000 Landscape program following this webinar. So welcome again, everyone. Please also, I think this webinar will be recorded. So if you don't agree or don't want to be seen, maybe please tell us. This webinar will last for 1.5 hours, and I will introduce briefly the carbon finance topic. This will be followed by a panel discussion with 3 panelists. Percy Summers from Conservation International, based in Peru. Jean-Louis Robadet from Regenerative Development Group, as well as Tammy Tullis from also the Regenerative Development Group, and Cindy Musyoki from Common Land, who is a carbon credit development specialist and also specialist of environmental impact assessment. So we'll have in total 4 panelists. We will, after this panel discussion, have a short Q&A session that will be followed with breakout sessions, and we will finish with some conclusions, and the moderators of the different breakout rooms will provide us with a few highlights from the conversations in their breakout rooms. So this is basically the program that will keep us together until I don't know, at least in France, in Central Europe, where I am, it will take us until 5:30. In other countries, obviously, will be different. So, carbon finance. I think we have all heard already about carbon finance. It's a lot about carbon finance relates to carbon credits in particular, and in the land use domain, voluntary carbon credits or and voluntary carbon markets. These carbon markets have grown. We will go back to this in the past decade and more. The Paris Agreement, which introduced carbon neutrality or net zero trajectories, make it important also to reinforce the sink function of the land, which for landscape has provided a number of opportunities to access finance particularly from companies willing to offset their emissions. So we'll see that it's a bit more complex than this, but a lot of the carbon finance market is driven by these companies that are interested in offsetting or reducing at least the emissions of their own emissions, and in certain cases of the emissions of their supply chains. So the carbon markets are so far have been driven particularly by private sector and by companies of the private sector, but this is changing slowly, and we see that governments also are willing to take part in the establishment of a number of rules for these carbon markets. A few definitions. So when we speak of carbon credits, in general, a carbon credit is an amount of 1 ton of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emissions that has been either removed or avoided. So these are the terms that are generally used are carbon credits, carbon offsets, or also carbon certificates. So basically, if an organization working on certain practices is able to show that and to demonstrate that they have reduced the emission by 1 ton of CO2 equivalent, then they get 1 carbon certificate, 1 carbon credit, or 1 carbon offset. In these carbon credits of offsets, there are in general 2 types. The removal carbon credits, which are linked to the absorption of carbon, of CO2 from the atmosphere, from forests or from agriculture land. So these are the removals. And then you have also avoidance carbon credits, which are related to the avoidance of carbon emissions from different practices. Currently, 80% of the carbon finance and carbon markets relate more to avoidance credits and not so much of removal carbon credits. We'll see that one of the issues is that carbon removals are more complicated. Also, another term that is important to remember, voluntary carbon markets is more or less the rule in the land use sector. There are very few official markets, which are also called compliance carbon markets, where people enter into regulated markets and have to comply with a number of rules for the reduction of their own emissions. So these are, so we will be speaking, I assume, mostly of voluntary carbon markets, meaning that those who enter these markets do it on a voluntary basis because in general, they want to offset their emissions. So another very important aspect is that to get these carbon credits, you need a certification. That's why also people use the term carbon certificates. You then need to demonstrate. And for this, a number of methodologies need to be in place that need to be validated first and then enter into a certification process. In the monitoring and the verification of the carbon either removals or avoidance, 3 or 4 important aspects need always to be remembered. So you need very serious methodologies to demonstrate, to quantify the amount of carbon that has been removed or avoided. And for this, you need, in general, a very serious baseline and a methodology to define where do you start with, basically, in order to also assess precisely how much carbon has been avoided or removed. So this requires serious monitoring approaches. Additionality is another very important aspect. In general, you can get a carbon credit if you can demonstrate that your project, that the activities that you have implemented would not have taken place without the project. So this is very much to avoid what is called double counting, so that the carbon removed should not be accounted for in different projects or activities. So additionality is quite tricky, but extremely important in all carbon credit issues. 2 other aspects which are becoming more and more important. So because removals are planned to increase in the future, long-term storage of carbon in forests, in soils, is also something that is very important, because if you remove carbon from the atmosphere in a given year, and this carbon is released because you harvest the trees, because you remove it from the soil a few years after, then of course the removal is not very efficient for climate change regulation. And the last aspect that is very important is more and more so sustainability issues are included in carbon credits, meaning that it's not only the carbon that is considered, but also other aspects like biodiversity or other ecological services or environmental services that need to be also considered, very often in a sort of do not harm approach. So you do good with carbon, but you shouldn't harm other aspects through the practices that are implemented. Once these certificates are generated, they need to be entered into public registries in order to also ensure the transparency for the carbon market. So there are different registries, like the American Carbon Registry, the Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standard also keeps open registries open to ensure that there is transparency in the processes. To go quickly then into the market issues. So the markets of carbon credits have grown in the past years. Basically, until 2005, the carbon markets were voluntary carbon markets were very low, but started to grow in a very abrupt way in 2005, until in 2-3 years doubled, tripled, and then became stable. And it's only in the past 2-3 years that carbon markets have grown really high, with I think $2 billion in the past years. In 21 and 22, they are likely to grow then to 40 to 50 billion by 2030. The prices, also the value of these carbon certificates, is also quite variable. This is also one of the issues for those who are engaged in practices that reduce that produce carbon certificates. It's not very clear how much not very clear how you get to implement a project if you are not sure of how much you will get from your carbon credit. So I will just quickly finish here before going to the landscapes, to say that there are at the moment a number of issues, particularly of coordination between supply chain actors. If in a territory you have different companies sourcing products, how do they coordinate their actions or their payments in these territories? So this has been shown as quite tricky, because companies have different objectives and also do not necessarily want to coordinate their efforts on the ground. There are also different issues about payments of these credits, because if you start implementing a project, do you pay carbon credits upfront, or are you waiting for getting the results implemented in order to pay these carbon credits? So these issues have led to a number of practices that I imagine we will now also enter into our panelist presentations, who will tell us how in landscapes these carbon finance mechanism can be or have been implemented. I will now start with the first question, asking our panelists if they can describe their project, how was the carbon finance mechanism designed to benefit the landscape initiative, and how they choose to tackle the challenge using the carbon finance mechanism. So we'll ask this first question to first Percy Sommer from Conservation International. Percy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks everyone for joining this session. Yes, sure. In our case, our project is located in northeastern Peru, in the slopes of the Andes that go into the Amazon. So it's a forest landscape with a road that crosses through the middle of the landscape that has brought a lot of pressure into those forests. And we started not as a landscape approach, but we actually started as a carbon project. And it was the development over time. We went from a carbon project to having a landscape approach, working with the local stakeholders into this much more integrated vision. And the carbon project has been key for the landscape because it has allowed us to leverage quite a bit of resources and to structure. It's like the anchor, no? The carbon project has become like the anchor or the heart in the landscape to be able to address many of the challenges that we have in this landscape. So we started in 2009. We started as a RED project, and it was a pilot project at the beginning. So there was an initial investment, kind of see proof of concept if this was going to work. And we eventually, after 3 years, we were able to reduce deforestation. As Daniel was explaining, there's avoidance and there's removals. This is an avoidance mechanism that we designed, and it's included in a protected area. And here comes another important aspect that Daniel mentioned, which is additionality. There are more than 1,500 families living inside the protected area, most of them working with coffee and expanding. They were expanding into the forest every year. So a lot of what the initial work was working with the farmers, reduce deforestation. And then when we started looking at how the drivers of deforestation were working into and related to the RED project and the park, we noticed that we needed to move much further, and from just looking at the protected area and the carbon project. The landscape approach allows us to see those relationships, those interactions between different stakeholders, and how this whole socio-ecological system works. That's what allows us to, or pushed us to move into an integrated landscape approach. The Alto Mayo landscape today has several projects, all under this one vision of reducing deforestation. And now we are also looking into connecting, restoring connectivity in the landscape, forest connectivity. And it's the carbon project after 10 years, more than 10 years. We're actually in year 14 or 15 of the project. We've been able to leverage the funds that has allowed us to expand not just actions in the protected area, but we've been able to leverage initially funds to start the process of facilitating an integrated landscape approach. And today we have a whole umbrella or portfolio of projects that are aligned under one same vision for the landscape, right? So I think it's worked a little bit more organically driven, the carbon aspect, and it's been so successful for us and locally also for local stakeholders to be able to participate, that now we also have a second carbon project that's actually started this year, which is mostly focused on indigenous communities inside the landscape that are neighboring the protected area, and they are also looking at both avoidance, RED project, and removals. So that's very high level look at what we're doing. And maybe just to finalize, I think the big contribution of the carbon project to the landscape has been to be able to bring those resources that are needed to address those big drivers of deforestation, in our case. So yeah, Daniel, I think that's yeah.
Thank you very much, Percy. We move quickly because we are a bit late to Jean-Louis Robadet. Do you also, Jean-Louis, can you explain us how you use carbon finance in your landscape project?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everybody. So the project I'll introduce starts from a slightly different starting point in that it really is a landscape finance approach. And actually, Shannon, if you cannot put the slide up just yet, thank you.
Sorry. Okay, no worries.
Yeah, so I'll introduce the context for the project, how it was catalyzed, and kind of some of the challenges that it explored. So first, let me say that this project started at the instigation of the IFC and the World Bank. So one DFI and one, of course, the World Bank. Well, they do everything, but let's say, development agency. And their inquiry was specifically around how to create investment opportunities in support of landscapes, nature, and biodiversity. So it didn't start with carbon, but the ask was much broader. And so we were engaged with the Regenerative Development Group with that ask. Can you go find investment opportunities and see what can be developed that could be attractive to the IFC and to the World Bank, that would have a nature positive, biodiversity positive benefits. So that was the initial ask. And so what we did is first to select a place, and that place is Southern Africa. And so we worked in partnership with a nonprofit organization that many of you probably know, the Peace Parks Foundation. And the Peace Parks Foundation has a mandate to support so-called transfrontier conservation areas. And these are 16, I think, as of today, very large protected areas across Southern Africa and covering, I believe, 18 countries. So an immense scope. And what we did first with the Peace Parks Foundation was explore across those landscapes what could be the opportunities to generate revenue and what are the value chain that could help do so. And so we looked across a number of value chains. So carbon was not the starting point. We looked at regenerative agriculture, we looked at tourism, we looked at water, we looked at different kinds of activities that can help restore these landscapes. And very quickly, as we're going through the process, we realized that carbon really was by far head and shoulder had the largest potential to help bring revenue into these landscapes. So that was really the starting point. I think it's important as we think about landscape approaches and landscape finance to put carbon in context, right? Carbon is one of a number of activities that take place in landscapes. What we found, and many of you, know that, is that right now, given what has happened in the world, that carbon really is also able to bring revenue, commercial revenue, right, through the sale of carbon credits in a way that other activities can't. So carbon becomes a bit of the elephant in the room in those landscapes, right? And that's why so many landscapes are exploring that. Now, what we also found, so we quickly landed on well, not quickly, but we landed on carbon and got the agreement of the Peace Parks Foundation, the IFC, the World Bank, that this was the activity worth exploring across these landscapes. So then what we did was to try to understand, so what is the state of development of these projects, right? And how could they be financed and supported in order to support the integrated landscape activities, because that was really the goal, right? For the Peace Parks Foundation, it's really about supporting landscapes, not about developing carbon. And there, what we found were a couple of things that were really interesting. So first of all, there had been a very successful case of a carbon project in Zambia, and Cindy, I'm sure you know about it, that had been developed by Biocarbon Partners, which is a very large, well, not necessarily very large, but they are a very successful project developer that's really emerged as one of the leading project developers in Africa, but also worldwide. So they had developed one successful project, but that was in one landscape, and it took years to develop, and it cost a lot of money. I think they received $20 million from USAID in order to be able to develop this project and then eventually sell the credits. So that was all good and well, but what about the other landscapes, right? And then how was that financed? And then we discovered a couple of things. One is that they had been massively subsidized to develop this project, right, by USAID to the tune of $20 million, right? So that was a nice little boost for them. But also that then the transaction was highly problematic, because what we then found is that the price was pretty low. I think they sold at $7 a ton, and most of the benefit remained with the project developer. And yes, there was a revenue sharing agreement with communities, and certainly communities are getting some revenue from these transactions, but nowhere close, in our estimation, to what would be fair and equitable, right? And this is not, to accuse BCP or anyone else. This is just how the market is currently operating. And so out of that, we thought, okay, well, is there a different model? Is there a different way to help finance these carbon projects? And so the financing model we developed, and I should say there is a case study that we wrote if anyone is interested, essentially looks at the whole cycle of carbon project development and recognizes the fact that one of the major gaps in financing, while the markets themselves are highly problematic, the significant gaps are really at the very early stages of project development. And for those of you who know the cycle of carbon project development, especially under REDD, but not only under REDD, you know that this project goes through stages, right? And stage one is feasibility, right? Is this landscape actually going to create the kind of benefit, ecological benefit, social benefit, and economic benefit that might warrant an investment? And what we found is that one of the reasons why projects weren't moving fast enough is that there was no money for early stage feasibility assessments. And BCP was really the only organization that was trying to raise money for these feasibility assessments. But again, they were going one at a time and they were really struggling. So that was the first gap that we saw. And then the second major gap that we saw was to say, well, okay, so let's say projects go through a feasibility assessment and are deemed to be viable projects. Then what? Right? Then what? Because the feasibility assessment itself costs money, but project development costs even more money. And then what we realized was that currently only BCP had the capacity to raise funds, and even they were struggling, but they were really doing it as a very traditional infrastructure development company, right? And they weren't really doing it, of course, as a community-owned indigenous enterprise. And so the second thing that we realized was that there was a need for an investment facility that could mobilize tens of millions of dollars from institutional investors in order to finance these projects, to pre-finance these projects, so that project development wouldn't have to depend on off-takers, which is currently the main model, right? You go to the offsetters, you negotiate a highly discounted price, and you use that money to develop your project. And instead, what if there could be a project finance facility in the landscape that could help finance these project development plans? So these are basically the two models, and my partner Tammy will dive into more of the details, especially of the investment facility. But I would say at a high level, and this is where it's relevant to the landscape finance perspective, is that what we see is that the major gap, while carbon markets have a lot of problems that we need to recognize, and I think the world is recognizing them, the major problem from a finance perspective is really in the early stage of financing of these projects. And that's where we propose something that is still conceptual at this stage. I want to say that as well. These models have not been fully implemented. One is a grant facility that would essentially fund the early stage feasibility assessments. And the second one is an investment facility that would be able to attract tens of millions of dollars and would be seeded in the landscape itself in order to fund locally owned and locally developed carbon projects. So I'll leave it here, and then Tammy will be able to go into a little more detail of what that looks like.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jean-Louis. We move on for the same question still. We move on to Cindy Musioki from Common Land.
Daniel, would it be possible for me to follow on from Jean-Louis, as he said I was going to follow on? Perhaps we could.
No, Tammy, I think the flow is that Cindy needs to go next.
Okay, got it.
Yes.
There will be a second question.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
So please, Cindy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I introduced myself, but I will repeat it again. My name is Cindy Musioki. I work for Common Land Foundation. And just an introduction to Common Land. We are a not-for-profit organization that basically does landscape restoration. So that's our core business. And in that way, we have, of course, identified and we are working in different landscapes across the globe. And one of our main things that we are doing currently is, of course, carbon, which enables us to work with and support different landscapes that we are working in. And as my previous presenter said, in 2019, Peace Parks Foundation, which of course works with transboundaries and working in different landscapes, approached us as Common Land to work on a project that would help finance projects and activities and initiatives that they are working in. And in that way, we developed a carbon project, which is the Common Land's first carbon project in Zambia, in the Simala Community Conservancy. So this project is a program of activities that is doing specifically cookstove projects for the conservancy. And it's a program of activities, so it's running across sub-Saharan Africa, but starting in Zambia. And so the project was designed and implemented. We are currently implementing it in our third monitoring phase. And how this project is structured is we as Common Land do the technical part of the carbon, and then we have Peace Parks who are running the project, and we have Simala Community Conservancy who implements the project in close conjunction with Peace Parks Foundation. It is also very important to note that with all the dynamics of carbon projects, and as previous presenters have said, of course, finance is a very big issue. Luckily for us, we have a revolving fund that we use to develop different projects and which we have been working on currently. And this fund allows us maybe to develop a project in one place and move to another landscape. And also, I would say we have a good buyer who is able to buy the credits as a relatively good price. I would say we probably get 2 times of what other developers are doing. Not just because it's a landscape project, but because also it's reinvestment into the communities that we are working in. And all the funds, because all the organizations working in the project are not-for-profit, Common Land, Peace Parks, and also Simala Community Conservancy, we only get out our management fees, and then we have the chunk of the money going back to the communities, and they are able to do their identified development goals. So each of the communities in the Simala Community Conservancy have village development action plans, which they have developed, of course, with assistance from Common Land and from Peace Parks Foundation. And now this carbon pricing or this carbon credits generated from the cookstove project is going to implement those projects. Yeah, so currently we are in Zambia. That's where we work in Simala Community Conservancy. And we are currently exploring, of course, conducting feasibility studies in Namibia, where I am currently. And we are in very advanced stages of moving to another landscape in close collaboration with WWF Namibia. So as of at the moment, that's the Cookstock project that we have. Not to say that we are only going to have Cookstock projects, we are also looking into AR and soil carbon and regenerative agriculture. And we're just looking for partners across the globe, and especially landscapes that Common Land is working in, and advancing these landscapes into better structures with just the same structure of operation. So currently we are exploring ARR in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Spain. Of course, because feasibility is a really expensive phase, and you don't have income coming in, this part of the project, the feasibility phase of carbon projects at Common Land, is supported by the landscape finance department. And so we don't really feel that impact of the strain at the moment. However, of course, it's something very critical, and sometimes if you're being asked to maybe invest 1,500 euros, you don't want to get into that before you know you get the carbon projects. Yeah, so that's currently how our project runs. And in addition to this, we are really, of course, looking into different financing mechanisms and expanding it beyond phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I think we are running a bit late, but it was very interesting to hear, I think, 3 different ways carbon finance is included in the project. Now, for the second question, it will be perhaps a bit more difficult. How is it related to the landscape approach? Basically, is the landscape partnership also involved in this carbon project, or are there only specific actors involved? And how? And I think it was already explained by Cindy. How is how are the payments that are generated by carbon credits used also to stimulate landscape transformation and activities at the landscape level? I think this is where now we want to go a bit more. So how useful is it for the landscape approaches? Percy, what are your lessons on these issues?
Yes, yes. In our case, since this grew much more organically than planned, we found already several groups already working in the landscape that already had a lot of momentum, and were working as the other 2 presenters mentioned. Carbon is a way to channel funds towards the landscape, but it's this more other processes that are looking at development, and working groups that are already looking at these issues at the landscape scale, that it's important for the carbon to be able to support those processes. So instead of creating a parallel process just for the landscape, we work with the working groups that were already there. The Watershed Committee was already a working group that was very well installed and very well institutionalized in the landscape, and the landscape corresponded to the upper part of that watershed. There was a working group with coffee, which is the main driver of deforestation, and they were very interested in being able to tackle a lot of the challenges that we were already doing at the park level, but expand this to the landscape level. There was already a working group to develop the low emissions development plan for the region. So this already working groups were what Decarbon was able to help leverage funds for and address these other issues at the landscape scale. And we tried to align what we were doing at the park level to expand and scale to that landscape level. And as I mentioned, that alignment was possible because the park was already part of a broader system of which the landscape was the territorial boundaries of, right? That said, I think it's important to stress that issue, no? That carbon should not be seen as a project itself. The aim is not the carbon credits. The aim is to see how the carbon project can help channel those funds that are needed to shift the landscape from business as usual to a green development pathway. No? Challenges are huge, as I mentioned. Part of the challenge was that at the beginning we thought we needed to scale using a platform for the landscape, and what we found was that there were already a lot of other institutionalized platforms already working development issues, trying to bring these challenges. So we decided that the best approach was to align what we were already doing to help finance those plans that were already working on place. No? So I think I'm gonna leave it there short and open it up for the next discussions.
Yes, and please, for the all those the participants, do not hesitate to start putting your questions in the chat. Now, Tammy, what is your take after the presentation of Jean-Louis on how the carbon finance was used to develop a landscape, the landscape initiative?
Thank you, Daniel. Can I ask you to put the slide up, please?
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. So Jean-Louis and other participants here have expressed the difficulty in terms of the financing of carbon projects, not least because the feasibility itself is hard to come by. It's expensive, and also the actual implementation can be overwhelming as well, the complexity of that. So with our work with the World Bank and IFC and looking into peace parks as the landscape, we came up with 2 different facilities, which we think are innovative in the way that it looks at the circular financial flows of carbon and how it can benefit the landscape. Shannon, maybe, perfect, thank you so much. All right. So maybe, is it possible to have it a little bit larger? I know it's thank you so much. Perfect. So I know Jean-Louis touched upon the landscape grant facility, and I will spend most of my time talking about the landscape finance facility. The grant facility, as Cindy was talking about, feasibility is expensive, and feasibility is something that is absolutely necessary. So what we've done here is actually break down the project development cycle into manageable chunks, right? Because when you do that, it's less overwhelming, and it's clear to see where the different types of financing, which includes grant funding and possibly investment financing, can all be aligned together for the different stages of a carbon project. And so quickly through the grant facility, grant funded by philanthropy, in our mind, would be used to go to different landscapes to check which ones are the highest octane, if you want, carbon-rich landscapes to use your valuable money on, right? So this can be quickly done in terms of and setting up a pipeline priorities you see there, and then doing the project assessments, and what comes out of that would be the data points and the conditions to issue the RFP. And now going on to the landscape finance facility, and I am going to be going this pretty fast. in lieu of other questions, other panelists in this short amount of time. So this in itself is really about trying to put the power with the landscape itself. So this is having a facility which is central to not just all contracts that happen in the landscape, but also being the holder of the financial flows. Now, to set up a special purpose vehicle such as this, you know, we would see the governance of that being, of course, the people who live in the landscape. And by doing that, we hope to always give a voice, a strong voice, to how their landscape is going to be used, and also transparency to the landscape in terms of pricing that different developers can come up with, right? Now, typically, and I say typically, most landscapes don't have a lot of money, and therefore they're credit weak, right? So in order to have strengthened credit, you need to have, let's say, the government as also on the governance, and possibly people like the World Bank, some people who can give this facility a credit enhancement. Why? Because if your counterparty is going to be dealing with literally millions and millions of dollars, then investors who would be invested in this, or anyone, needs to be sure that this is a strong organization that has strong governance, right? So this is why it's not, you know, it's not just, oh, we'll just set up an SPV next week. No, we need to have the legitimacy from the country, the legitimacy of the landscape. And, you know, we could have a project developer on the board, etc. But the most important elements would be probably the government, absolutely the landscape, people who live on a landscape, and a DFI who would credit and enhance this. And as you see from all the flows that we have here, so we're flipping the switch here. So instead of project developers coming to landscapes and buying up the credit rights, right? We're saying, we're the landscape, we know how valuable we are. Project developers, you can come to us, and we could have lots of project developers come to us with what your terms would be. The reason why things are opaque right now is because there's not a facility like this. So you have one project developer come in. This is, you become a price taker. You don't have a negotiating ability, right? This flips the switch. The reason why we think that this will make sense is because let's think just in terms of Africa and the massive carbon sink that Africa is, right? The landscapes are extremely valuable. And this is why this facility is so important, to give the voice, legitimacy, and the counterparty for that. And so just quickly going through some of this, you know, so the landscape finance facility would be the counterparty to all contracts. Why is that important? Well, because if you are the counterparty contracts, that means that you have to show what the pricing is, how much your work is going to cost, right? It's not opaque. And in that negotiating, you can have the negotiation of what really makes sense for the landscapes. So just to give a quick example before I leave this conversation, very important, you know, with the carbon credits, right? So sorry, what is fairly normal that I see is project developers and other entities take an equity slice. What they mean by that is that they'll take, let's say, 20% of all carbon revenue for the next 10 years, whatever that is. I have never seen a landscape be given that. You can imagine how much money that is, right? And also, you know, Jean-Louis alluded to the pricing being at $7. We've seen BCP do pricing at $5 before, and we know the pricing is much higher than that. So this is all about giving the power to the landscape for equitable distribution. No way are we against project developers and other people having making a profit. We just want it to be much more equitable to the landscape and transparent in terms of what's going on. So I'm going to leave it there because otherwise,
yeah,
on and on and on.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Yes, the importance of the landscape
Just
facility. Yes.
one final comment I forgot. So we're talking. So we have the money which is needed for feasibility, and we also need the money which is for the implementation rate. The implementation piece, for example, could be $100 million. It really does cost that much money. What this facility means is that this facility could be the issuer, right? So this becomes an investable special purpose vehicle. So if you were to issue a bond or a loan, this would be where it would be done, right? So instead of going to corporate off-takers for the money, and of course they want highly discounted pricing in order to give you the money for implementation, you retain control. You're issuing a loan or bond to borrow the money in the market, which, trust me, is going to be much lower price than giving away your carbon credits way into future just to receive a tiny bit for the communities.
Yes. Thank you, Tammy. Without further ado, let's go to Cindy. Cindy, you already alluded to the role of carbon credits. Do you want to add a little bit? And if we can keep it short, it would be good because we are running really late.
Indeed. Just as I mentioned, when it comes to feasibility studies, because we are supporting landscape developers whom we are already working on in different landscapes, this finance, like for example, if it's a landscape, maybe in the Netherlands, we would support them to do the feasibility study with financing from landscape finance. But for development, as I've said, we are currently using a revolving fund, which is, in very simple terms, a loan, an interest-free loan that is repaid from the income from the carbon credits when they come in. And when it comes to the returns to the landscape or to the people that are in the same landscape, for example, for Simala, we have this, you'd find that probably 90% of the project cost or benefits will go back into the community. Of course, that's inclusive of the project costs. And one of the key challenges, however, we've had is communities or the people in the landscape don't have structures, or the structures keep on changing. And in that way, for example, in our current project, we've not really implemented the village development plans because of community structures. So this is one of the challenges. However, we are addressing it because we are different partners and everyone is just pulling up their socks to what they need to do. Yeah, that's in simple terms how our finance comes in.
Thank you, Cindy. And we move on now to the third question. I would like each speaker to try to keep it short. We will skip the breakout sessions and have a Q&A simply after this third question. So the third question is around the key lessons learned in the process of designing these solutions and these carbon credits, and what recommendations you would have for landscape leaders who would seek to engage in carbon finance. So we start again with Percy. Percy, what would be your lessons learned and recommendations? In 2 minutes, please. 3 minutes.
Yes, maybe, yeah, following up with what's been mentioned by the other speakers, like carbon as a means for finance, but yes, it's tricky when the negotiation table is not level, right? And if the investors come in with the upfront money to develop the project, they also want to negotiate all the terms. And a carbon project is something that is set for the next 20 to 30 years, right? So my take on that would also be like, as long as there's not a facility, what we've been working with is how do we get that upfront money to come from not the final buyers, but from other means, right? In our case, mostly grants, since we're an NGO, and that's what we've been working with the indigenous people for this new RED project that we're setting up. But yes, I would advise landscape leaders to see the different options that there is and different investing types to be able to do the feasibility study and develop the PDD, the project development document, without that will allow them to negotiate in a much more fair way. The other thing that is important to stress, carbon is not a silver bullet. Carbon is part of a portfolio of options for the landscape, and it has to be seen as that. It's very powerful, but yes, also always be wary that it's not the only one, and that context is key. No, if it's appropriate or not, the feasibility study should definitely help, but keep options open and see how carbon can complement other financial mechanisms. So with that, yes, I will pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Percy. Jean-Louis, what are your takes and lessons learned? You are muted, Jean-Louis.
Yeah. I think for us, there are a few things that really stood out. So one is just how extractive current carbon markets are. And while it's a very generic statement, while a lot of the problems that are being highlighted and were in the press recently, in The Guardian, in the New York Times, in other, pretty mainstream outlets, touch on MRV, right, on verification, and touch on the greenwashing aspect, right, and that companies get away essentially with not having to, reduce their emissions, which is actually not true, but that's the mainstream narrative. The real issue we found is really that the market, as it's currently developing, is developing like oil and gas and extractive industries, essentially where you have very few players capable of extracting a really valuable resource, in this case, carbon, and getting most of the benefit, right? And so it's evolving as a very closed market. And we experience it directly in working with the Peace Parks Foundation, Biocarbon Partners, and others. And it's actually quite ingrained, even in the mindset now, that, oh, that's kind of the way it is, right? And because we're so used to these models, it's hard to imagine something different. One lesson learned for us is that this will require a transformation in our mindsets, and in really thinking about who owns the asset, not just what is the value of the asset and what is the price of the asset, but really who owns it. And for landscapes, and I'm using the term landscape loosely because landscape is not a jurisdiction necessarily, to really want to take that power back, to not give it away. And it's very concerning right now when you see some of the things that are happening where entire countries are giving away their carbon stock, right, to other countries. I mean, I think we're seeing some really interesting trends, and personally I find them worrisome, but, other people may have different ideas. But I think that needs to be reversed, and that's really, really hard because the way the market works right now is not designed for that. So message number one to landscape leaders and governments, actually, and others who are in landscape partnerships, is to say there are ways for you to retain ownership of the asset and to finance yourself to develop that asset. Don't think that you have to invite South Pole or BCP or others, and this is not a critique of these companies. Of course, every company can be criticized in a number of ways, but it's the very model, right? You can become that project developer. That's number one. Lesson number two, these things are really expensive and they have to go through phases. And unless there are financial mechanisms at the early stages that are either highly concessionary or purely grant-based, purely subsidized, it's going to be very hard on the other side to create an equitable distribution. Because once you go to an off-taker, once you go to an investor, as Percy, I think, said, they will set the conditions and they're going to squeeze the system, right? So you have to create space. We have to create space at the early stages. And that's why the grant facility is so critical. Now, Cindy, you said you, Common Land, are able to receive grants directly because you have donors and funders, and that's fantastic. A lot of landscapes are not in that position. And we see it in Malawi right now with Mount Mulanje, where we work, like there is no common land, so to speak, right? And it's a real struggle, right? And so how do we indigenize those financing facilities so that they exist in the landscape? So that's lesson number one: invest in those early stage, highly concessionary, grant-based mechanisms, and don't feel bad about it. Because there's also a narrative that says, oh, we have to go to the investment community. No, we can only go to the investment community when we're ready to go to the investment community. Most landscapes are not, right? So that's number two. And then number three is really the role that institutions like the World Bank, DFIs, the government can play in de-risking the larger investment mechanisms and putting their credit in service of the landscape, not as an extractive force, but really saying, no, we will help you. We will put our credit rating to benefit you. And that way you will be able to attract these tens of millions of dollars that are needed at good terms, right, in order to fully develop these projects. And this is where one lesson learned for us is that it's really hard to move these institutions. The IFC, after we did this report, wasn't able to move really, or the World Bank, or even Peace Parks. They looked at this model and they didn't quite know what to do with it, to be honest. And I don't blame them, because it's really hard. But someone has to be a champion for this model, someone with capacity to truly help the landscapes stand up those types of facilities. So that would be lesson number three, like having real champions who come in and put their might and their power and their wealth and their influence and their credit rating in support of these initiatives, so that they can be truly landscape owned and landscape led.
Daniel, I think you might be on mute.
Sorry. Cindy, your final lessons learned also, can you share this with us?
I would say currently what we are experiencing, it's probably on the other side, as I mentioned, maybe delays in what we anticipated to be the objective of these projects. But I would also say we are indeed expanding to other countries and expanding to new landscapes. And with that also comes maybe some challenges in project design, and also having partners maybe who don't have the same objective as we do. I would say it becomes a little bit complicated to have partners who are just who are like maybe NGOs or not-for-profit who are implementing projects in the different landscapes. Also, of course, because we have all these different projects that we want to work on, finance also becomes an issue, but it's something, it's like, it becomes more like more financing, of course. like seeking grants and becomes part of the project, which is a little bit complicated. And with that, I would say also the other thing is, if for carbon developers, we all have these parameters that are changing when it comes to projects, things like FNRB, which will, if they go through, they would adversely affect carbon projects, and maybe we will not be able to do landscape restoration, which was our goal. So all these things implemented makes it a little bit like it's like you fear what the future will be when it comes to carbon finance.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we still have 15 minutes, and I think I would open the floor for now discussion with the audience, with participants. So do we have questions in the chat? Not sure.
I can say I have a couple of my own questions that I put into the chat.
Okay, Seth, go ahead.
But others I want, give space. So either, people can write in the chat or just raise
or just raise their hands.
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of things, and thank you so much to the presenters here. I mean, there's a lot to chew on. There was this on the specifically, so the RDG model. I think this is really, it's really fascinating. To try to find a way to bring together carbon finance with other kinds of finance. I mean, I think that's what we're trying to get at here. It's sort of, how do you bring carbon finance together with other kinds of finance that together would lead towards this landscape scale transformation? And how does that interact with the current model of carbon finance? And so I mean, the specific question is, like, do we know of examples where someone has set up basically a carbon fund, but they have the lens of the carbon a fund that can invest in carbon projects, but that has a broader lens, like they can do other kinds of things. This is even zooming backwards, some of the discussions that we've had with development banks around landscape finance generally, is the responses have been, oh yes, this makes sense, this is what we should be doing. We don't have the capacity internally to sort of do this type of analysis, this landscape scale analysis, and we also don't have like the diversity of investment capacities here. So I'm wondering if that's a challenge here. I mean, carbon investment has become so specialized. Like, it's really like you have to be almost like a professional in carbon finance to develop these projects. And Daniel was talking all about the registries and the monitoring and evaluation systems and the voluntary market and whatever, all the COP negotiations, all this kind of stuff. Does it become like kind of so insular that it's hard to think of the carbon finance as something within a broader suite of finance? I guess I've asked a couple of questions here, but that's what's coming to my mind in these discussions. So any responses from the panelists or anyone else would be welcome.
Yeah, I'll provide a quick perspective because we did do a detailed analysis of a variety of types of activities in the context of transfrontier conservation areas. So the context was really interesting because TFCAs are a pretty developed framework where there is Peace Parks Foundation, there are many donors, there are many DFIs. Not all TFCAs are well developed, so to speak, institutionally, but it's a very rich context. And in fact, when we started the work, PPF had a business plan that they shared with us that was a multi-activity business plan, right? So it included tourism, it included regenerative agriculture, it included other activities. I think what we found, and this is relevant to your question, and I think relevant to how we engage with DFIs and others and investors. First is that to the extent we can make it as easy as possible for them to engage in terms that they can understand, even if we see other benefits, but we don't have to give them the whole kitchen sink. right? Because right now, there are ways in which they can operate that they recognize, and I believe we can present things to them in a way that make it palatable. In fact, that's why we picked carbon, and we tested this model with investors. We did. We went out, and in fact, it was shared within the IFC, and others was like, yeah, that looks great. Make it happen. Build up this SPV, stand it up the way you're describing. That sounds great. Now, of course, there was no money to do that. That's a different problem. But they were very happy. Why? Because they understand carbon for the most part. What do they understand? They see that there is cash flow that is very, very important for investors, right? And not all activities have recognizable cash flow. They see a lot of untapped value. They see a growing market. They see a market that has premium pricing and discounted pricing. So if you can get the premium price, then it's a really good deal. And this could give you the premium price. So it keeps it simple. Now, for the broader landscape benefit, I think, Seth, and it's something we should explore in the context of our conversation, where the real power comes is in the circular nature of this model. Because if you look at the diagram, which I know is a bit heavy, right? It's not an easy one to absorb, but there are circular flows of money, so that once the system gets going, money comes back. Now, once money comes back, nothing stops the SPV and the landscape finance facility for them investing in other things. So the question is, how do you get the first monies? How do you stand up those kinds of facilities in a way that makes it really attractive to investors to pour millions and millions and millions of dollars at the outset? But then if the design is such that it's really landscape aligned, then once it's up and running, it can evolve in all sorts of ways, right? It can finance water, it can finance clean energy, it can finance transportation, it can finance all sorts of things. But at the outset, at least that would be one of our lessons learned in speaking with investors. Keep it simple. Give them something they can recognize, something that is, okay, I get that. And then start there.
Thank you. We have questions from Lucy. Lucy, do you want to ask your questions or you want me to read them? I don't know if Lucy, she's left perhaps. No, she's still here. Could it be possible if we introduce ILM to institutions, especially in universities and colleges, as a means of bringing students up to speed on various issues, including carbon finance and other aspects through training in set objectives for championing ILM and related objectives, basically? Does anyone want to respond to this? Introduce ILM to institutions and bring students up to speed on various issues, including carbon finance. Has anyone something to say? Cindy?
Yeah, I would say indeed, it would be great to include that in institutions, in even community-based organizations. I would say the most also important thing is to identify what the communities are doing, or the gaps or the opportunities that they can have to bring carbon financing to the landscapes that they live in. So in terms of institutions, definitely something very great to introduce to students and for them to learn, even when they are doing development in their communities, there are different options to finance different activities. For the organizations, if they have projects that can lead to carbon finance to circulate more financing into the landscapes, I think the best way to do is probably reach out to organizations that are doing carbon, and you can be able to just get a few tips and maybe propel the communication from that point.
Thank you. how can we bring, and it's another question from Lucy, who is very active in the chat. How can we bring locally led organizations and civil societies struggling to understand carbon finance so that they become champions of the same? So, and she also, Lucy, is suggesting to have special webinars with students to inform them on these topics. Some comments also on this question?
Yes. For the students, I would think, I would say definitely webinars would be a good thing. But also I think the best way probably to make them understand is probably take them to a carbon project and just explain to them with reference to what is going on, and they can understand more. And also take advantage of the registries and because most project information, you will find it in the registries. And also if you contact, if like, for example, you ask me, where are the project documents, what does it do? It's just a link away. So I'd say you can use this avenue to definitely pull up their learning and share more field-based experiences.
Thank you very much, Cindy. Could we say that carbon finance mechanisms are a very interesting entry for the landscape partnership to start developing cash flow mechanism that can be used then for other types of projects? Because I heard you, Jean-Louis, also mentioning a bit of this. So and Cindy also in your case with the stoves, and we know also the deforestation has had a lot of programs on this. So is it for the landscape a sort of training model there that can be used then to scale other type of activities? Can you just respond in 2-3 sentences, not more?
Yeah, so what I would say is yes, and not exclusively. And I think right now there is a risk that they might be seen as the 800-pound gorilla, right? Or that shiny object that may or may not have as much return. So it's really about then understanding what does that actually mean, and then making it part of a portfolio of activities within the landscape and not put all the eggs in the carbon basket.
Thank you. Cindy, do you have
yeah, I completely agree. It is one of the mechanisms to finance landscapes, but it is not exclusively the only finance that can go there, of course. But I would also like to mention that carbon markets are very, for lack of a better word, sensitive, and anything can happen to them anytime. And even like, for example, I'll give you an example with publications that I've made on Cookstock projects, and some people or developers indicated that carbon prices went down. So it is something important to learn. Also, I would say let's open our mind, of course, and explore the opportunities that are there to finance different activities.
Thank you. Percy?
Yes, in our case, we've used the carbon finance for other means. No, for example, we partner with a biobusiness incubator to be able to finance local initiatives for biobusinesses. So I think the opportunities are big, but yes, be wary that carbon is not the solution for everything, and that we have to be able to complement carbon flows with other kind of mechanisms, right?
And indeed, this is one of the challenges also, and how to use them best to trigger something else that goes much beyond carbon, because I think this is one of the difficulties. And I think Seth also alluded in the chat to the fact that biodiversity credits are using the same path. So of course, a lot of the lessons learned with the carbon finance will now be brought into biodiversity issues and biodiversity finance. And I think for landscapes, again, probably can be a way also to diversify also sources of finance, but with the all the caveats that were mentioned here, with the price of the credits that is highly variable, with the fact that in many cases, if you don't do what Jean-Louis was presenting, that is having a facility at the center of the landscape that is able to generate the project in order not to be only dependent from project developers who dictate basically what you can do. I think this is where we see that landscape need to become much stronger also to be at the center of the game, and not be dependent on basically the finance or the carbon finance industry, which is a bit shaky. And we have seen that the recent story has shown that a lot of reputation risks can destroy also the efforts of local communities. And so it's very important. I think after this conversation, the way and the role of landscape and of landscape finance mechanism to really run the show and ensure that it's not other people who are benefiting also from the credits. This will be really something extremely important for our landscape initiatives. I think we have run out of time, and so I would now thank very much our panelists and all those who have contributed to this webinar. I think this is the third webinar of the series, and we will now summarize a number of findings and outcomes of the conversations that will be also shared with all the participants. So thank you very much for your participation, and I think again congratulations to all. It was very interesting to have this exchange.
Thank you.
Bye, and thank you, Daniel, for moderating.